وأصحابه أجمعين أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله أما بعد. Continuing our lessons on Usul Fiqh. Last week we discussed the issue of Al-Aam Al-Khas, general and specific, and we broke it down and with some examples as well. And maybe we'll look at one example today to help us to remember some of what we mentioned. But our main focus for today will be on the discussion of Al-Mutlaq Al-Muqayyad, which is restricted and unrestricted. So before going there, we need to remind ourselves of these issues that we looked at before about Aam al-Khas, general and specific, and how to go about applying them, because of course the general theory is what you come with first, then you go into application. That's the true benefit of Usul Fiqh. It's not to just have a set of principles, but being able to apply them. Otherwise the person won't really be benefiting, because it's not just nadariyat, right? Nadariyat is theories, right? You have to have tatbiq, where's the application? Where is the fact that you can take a text and you can understand it, or at least follow the understanding of the ulama? So to give us an example, let's take a look at a mas'ala, an issue, in which we look at from the angle of Aam al-Khas, general and specific. طيب, the issue is to do with tayammum. And we looked at this before, but we're going to review it. This time from the angle of Usul Fiqh. The ulama differed what can be used to make tayammum with, or we can use to make tayammum with. And the argument goes back to, what is it that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala permitted us to use to make tayammum? What is it? So if we go to the Quran, we see in Surah Ma'idah, Al-Ma'idah, ayah number 6, ayat al-wudu, قال الله تعالى فإن لم تجدوا ماء, if you don't have any water, فَتَيَمَّمُوا صَعِيدًا طَيِّبًا, then perform tayammum with sa'idan tayyiba. The key word then is sa'id. Sa'id is often translated as earth or as some form of dirt, right, or dust. What seems to be correct is that we'll translate it as earth, clean earth. So the ulama then discussing this ayah, they looked at this ayah and they differed. And they differed because, are we allowed to use only dust and dirt, means dust alone, or anything that comes from the earth? So difference of opinion then was sa'id, this word, does it refer to just dust, or does it refer to dust, earth, sand, rocks, you keep going, whatever you want to add to it, that comes from the ground? So that's difference of opinion between the ulama. And this is because the word sa'id, it's a word, it's mushtarak, it has more than one meaning. So scholars were disputed, what is exactly clean earth? So the Shafi'is, they took the view, Imam Shafi'i and Abu Yusuf and others, that only dust, you can only make tayammum with dust. Okay, and this is their argument, this is only dust. And they argue that this is what's intended by the word sa'id. This is what is intended by the word sa'id. And they're going to bring a proof. As for Imam Ahmad, Imam Malik, Abu Hanifa, and the Zahiriyya, so majority ulama, Imam Ahmad, Malik, Abu Hanifa, and Zahiri and others, so 3 of the 4 madhabs and others, they said anything that comes from the earth can be used to do tayammum, anything that comes from the earth. And so the argument then for them is that it's not specific to just the dust, rather anything that's on the earth can be used. Okay, so we're following this the argument. They're saying that anything that comes from the ground, so it'll be dust, dirt, rock, stone, cement, all of that, if it comes from the earth. If it doesn't come from the earth, then you can't. So when you look at the evidences, you see that it's a difference of opinion based on al-aam al-khas, general and specific. Because Imam Shafi'i, rahimahullah, Abu Yusuf and others, they argue that the word as-sa'id, or sa'id and tayyiba, Allah uses, even though it has more than one meaning, it is specified to mean dust in the hadith of Hudayfa fi Sahih Muslim. So they bring the hadith Hudayfa. In Sahih Muslim, Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, he says that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave me favor as an ummah over other ummahs. And what is the wording? He says, وَجُعِلَتْ تُرُبَتُهَا لَنَا طَهُورٌ. Allah has made the dust for us as a purification. وفي الرواية وَجُعِلَتْ تُرَابُ لِي طَهُورًا. and the dust has been made purified for us. So they say Sa'id, clean earth, means dust, because the ayah is general, and we're going to specify it using the hadith. Everybody's following the argument? That makes sense. You can specify an ayah in the Quran with a hadith. So they're saying the ayah is general, hadith Hudayfa fi Sahih Muslim is specific. And what's the rule when you have a specific text and a general text? Al-khas yuqaddim ala al-'am, right? It's just restriction or restricted text takes precedence over the 'am, the general text. If there's a conflict, there's a key word, between two texts, one is general, one is specific, which one takes precedence? Specific. Well, you have to always remember that. If there's a conflict, that's the key word. We're going to say there's not, but they say there is. Because the ayah says Sa'id Tayyiba, and we're saying, the hadith of Hudayfa says, At-turab or turbatuha. So that's dust. So that's the intent of Allah's statement, because Sa'id can be many things. طيب, the Jumhur ulama, the majority responded by saying that the ayah is general. And the rule is, general texts are kept upon the generality, right? Didn't we say that last week? A general text is kept general unless there's a specifier. So we're not going to go jump to this. So al-asl is baqa, it remains upon its al-umum, umumiyyat, yani its umum nature, its general nature. So what's the proof then? How do we respond to them? The majority say then the description of hadith of Hudayfa, or the mention of dust in the hadith of Hudayfa is not a specifier, it's just clarification. Pay attention, look at the Jumhur are correct here. The hadith of Hudayfa says dust. Is dust from the earth? Yes, it's afrad, from the afrad, the specific entities of a general class. So let's use the umbrella term, clean earth. What goes underneath clean earth? Dust, dirt, soil, stone, rock. So they said Nabi Sallallahu just mentioned an example of the types of things that go underneath Sa'id Tayyib. Not that it is the only one. So they responded by saying that it's just a clarification, not a specification. And now we take a benefit that the correct opinion is the Jumhur, the majority opinion. Because just because one hadith says dust, the other one says earth, the rule we're going to look at, if you can combine, if you can harmonize between a general text and a specific text, then there's no need for precedence of specific over general. If they're working together, you carry them together. If there's a contradiction, then you go to the specification. Everybody's with me so far? So that's it. So the ulama, the Jumhur, they mentioned in a qaida, which is that dhikr al-afrad al-umum, mentioning specific entities of a general ruling, which agrees with the generality, is tansisun la takhsis. What does that mean? It's just a fancy way of saying, if you mention one category from the things that fall into the general, it's just clarification, not specification. Because if someone told you are dust and earth, two different things, they're kind of the same thing. One falls into the other. Khalas. It would only be needing to go to the restriction if one cannot be carried on the other. So for example, if they said that the word Sa'id means paper. Paper is a different category. It doesn't fall into it. Now we have a problem because earth and paper are two different things. So if they brought an evidence to suggest that Sa'id and Tayyib means paper, which doesn't mean earth, then we have a problem here because now you can't combine them. But all we're going to say is that clean earth, underneath clean earth falls dust, khalas. It's just an example, not a specification. That shows you then that when you look at Usul al-Fiqh with the Fiqh Masail, it becomes easy to see who has the Qawl al-Sahih. Qawl al-Jumhur al-Sahih here. It's qawi, right? Because Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam didn't say, nor did he only make tayammum with dust. Right? Because Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam used the earth, yes. He used the wall before, yes. And you keep going. So the Sahaba, if they held the view that only dust, we said in the Fiqh classes, that the Sahaba used to walk around looking for dust when it's time for tayammum? Never, right? So why? Because they understood the am. You see? If it was khas, they would have walked around and said, oh, no tayammum illa biturab. Where is the proof for that? So khalas, the Jumhur are correct because always you carry both texts together unless you can't. If you can't, then the Shafi'i view will be correct because they had the upper hand by bringing a specific text. But this is not the situation. So hopefully that allows us to think about when you're reading into these issues, you need to think about and ask yourself a question. What is the difference of opinion on and how and who is arguing what? If you look at the arguments, you can start seeing how the rules apply. So the majority of scholars were correct in this opinion because they were able to harmonize both texts. And harmonizing takes precedence over making tarjih, giving preponderance to one view or the other. Let us move now to our today's lesson, which is on mutlaq and muqayyid. So this is the next two pairing. These terminologies are not the same, right? Al-mutlaq, which means unrestricted. Wal-muqayyad, it means restricted. Different than saying al-aam al-khas. Sometimes we say aam al-mutlaq, it means two different things. Mutlaq means unrestricted. So according to fiqh, usul fiqh, something is mutlaq, unrestricted. ما دل على الحقيقة بلا قيد. That which indicates one entity with no conditions or restrictions. So someone may ask the question, what's the difference between mutlaq and aam? Easy. Mutlaq is only one entity. Aam is a word for many entities. Khalas, that's it. The word Sa'id, how many things fall under it? Many. The word, for example, let's look at an example. The word raqaba, a slave. How many things are there? One, khalas. If it's one entity, فهو mutlaq. Many entities fall into it, فهو aam. That makes sense? There we go, that's it. I don't have to get confused. Some people, they have mutlaq aam, they get confused. It's simple. If you're talking about one entity, it's mutlaq wa muqayyad. If you're talking about a word that has many entities, it's aam al-khas. Because aam al-khas has to do with, I have an entity, a word that has many entities, I'm taking one out of the entities. So for example, I have a word called Sa'id, it means clean earth. Underneath there are many things, and the Shafi'is took the word dust out. They didn't mean takhsis, they specified dust for the whole word. Now I come and say, let's talk about dust. Now dust is one entity, so we're talking about mutlaq and muqayyid now. So all mutlaq means is any word that indicates a reality or some entity or an idea or whatever you want to talk about, bila qaid, no qualifiers. Qaid is used to mean qualifiers. No adjectives, as we're going to see, no extra names, no descriptions. So to give you the example, let's take a look at the ayah. Right? So that's mutlaq. And muqayyid means the opposite. An entity which has been specified with a specific quality. Right? So for example, the ulama say restricted means well, you have one entity or one idea or one item and you restricted it with some adjectives or some another noun or another qualifier. Call it qualifier. Qaid is a qualifier. Let's give an example, it becomes easy. قال الله تعالى. Allah says in the Quran about كفارات, يعني the kafara, the expiation. فَتَحْرِيرُ رَقَبَةٍ مِنْ قَبْلِ أَنْ يَتَمَاسَّ. So Allah says then the expiation is فَتَحْرِيرُ رَقَبَةٍ, to free a slave مِنْ قَبْلِ أَنْ يَتَمَاسَّ, before the man and wife touch each other, have intimacy. It means that he has to expiate for doing this act of dihar, calling his wife like his mother's back. So the idea is that just look at the word فَتَحْرِيرُ رَقَبَةٍ. Allah says to expiate you must free a slave. Slave is what? How many entities? Only one. Does Allah tell us what kind of slave? So this is called then mutlaq. We call it mutlaq because Allah didn't tell us what kind. We're going to find out later. We look in the Quran and Sunnah more, we find out which type. But when Allah just says فَتَحْرِيرُ رَقَبَةٍ, any slave, this is what the ayah is saying, any slave, you can do it. So difference in mutlaq and aam now, when you use the word restricted and general, restricted means one entity of any type of that, any kind of that entity. Whereas aam has to do with not kinds only, it has to do with kinds and types. So the better way to look at it, if you're talking about slaves, you're talking about what kind of slave? Muslim, non-Muslim, black, white, tall, young, male, female. That's, what do we call these? These are types. And when you talk about aam, you're talking about kind. Kind, right? So for example, bahimatul an'am. How many kinds are there? You guys know the difference between kind and type? We use it a lot the same, but it's not the same word. Kind and type is two different things. Kind is like how many animals are in the bahimatul an'am? Goat, cow, camel. Are they the same? What are they? The same types? Same kind. They fall into the same. So this is why you can think about if you have one entity, then you talk about what kind is it or what type are we going to deal with. When we talk about aam, we're talking about okay, there's many entities, they all have the same, they're all the same group. So Allah says free a slave. If a man's freed a female slave, does it count? Allah says raqabah. Right? So it could be male, female, they didn't qualify here. But some they say here, raqabah is going to deal with one individual. Right? So you're going to free a slave. If someone freed a Muslim a kafir, someone who's dark skin, light skin, just on the ayah alone, he wouldn't be wrong. But then we're going to find later you have to make taqeed. You're going to restrict this because we're going to find another ayah that tells us what kind is it. Because in Surah Nisa, it talks about raqabatil mu'mina, or a believing slave. So now we see the Muslim one. So when we got the other ayah, it talks about believing slave. This one said just a slave. So what are we going to do here? One is restricted, the other one is unrestricted. The first one we're looking at unrestricted, mutlaq, and the second one is muqayyad. What is the qayd? What is the condition or qualifier? Mu'minah, believing. Does that make sense? So it's like when you think about the word muqayyad, scholars say really what's happening here is you're qualifying by mentioning additional descriptions. Okay, so the benefit we're going to take from today's study, anytime we find unrestricted terms in the texts, we must carry them upon the restricted texts, or restricted text. Unrestricted must be carried upon the restricted, because together we get the intent behind what Allah is saying. Now some may say why sometimes we have them separated. Why? The reason why they can be separated is for many benefits, but the benefit we take is that since Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He is the revealer of the Quran and Sunnah, sometimes He mentions some things unrestricted and sometimes restricted. But because it's the same speaker, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and the hukum, as we're going to see, the ruling and the causes are similar, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants us, the people of deen, to carry them together. Because how does the Quran and Sunnah work? They're harmonious, right? They work together, as we'll see. So this discussion then is a lot different than the discussion about general and specific. Hence, the difference of opinion in general and specific are much more than the conversation about mutlaq and muqayyad. Why? Because they're not as many, only because, right, as we saw, the arguments the ulama have, some of them they differ, like the Hanafiya, on the terminology of mutlaq and muqayyad, sorry, aam al-khas, especially the word aam. So with that being said, how do we know a text is unrestricted? So we have to get into our conversation. How do we know? So the scholars, they say if you want to know a text is unrestricted, what you're going to look for is a particular wording, and it's only two wordings, two types of wordings, which makes it a little bit easier, right? Two types of wordings. Number one, an indefinite word in the context of affirmation. Or in other words, an indefinite word in a command context, in a command sentence. Indefinite word in a command, or you could say, a context of affirmation, and there was something being affirmed or being commanded, which is the opposite of al-aam. What was the wording for aam? Who remembers? An indefinite word in a denial, right, context. So the wording with ulama used then, an-nakira fi siyaq al-ithbati, an-nakira, indefinite word, fi siyaq al-ithbati, in the context of affirmation, mutlaq. وَالنَّكِرَ فِي سِيَاقِ النَّفِي الْعَامِ. The opposite. And that shows you the beauty of the deen. One word, two different contexts, two different meanings. That's our deen. That's how the deen works. So if you have an indefinite word in a command form, or sentence, it is mutlaq. If you have an indefinite word in a negation form, or denial, or other forms, it is a general text. So now you have to be careful. You see something general unrestricted, you have to be careful, right? Because you might tell someone that and you're like, yeah, but you can't fool some people. Someone says, what are you talking about, right? They're gonna ask you, how did you get there? So when we use terminologies, we have to be careful, right? Mutlaq al-muqayyad and aam al-khas. The benefit we take, that's the first one. We'll see an example now of that. So let us take a look at the ayah we just cited. فَتَحْرِيرُ رَقَبَةٍ مِّن قَبْلِ أَن يَتَمَاسَّ. Allah says, فَتَحْرِيرُ, which is here, it means that the expiation is the freeing of a slave before they touch one another and have been intimate. Is this a command? Yes. Allah isn't saying you must free it, not you should. Should means here must. So raqaba, is the alif lam on it? No, so it must be then nakira. And what's nakira mean? No alif lam. Right? Remember, so that's why raqaba tin. Right? I go back to Medina books, right? Those things matter, right? Now you're gonna see, right? All that stuff, why, what's the dhamma, no dhamma, matters. Right? Because raqaba tin means it is indefinite. And so someone may say, what matter does that matter? Because we're talking about mutlaq here. So mutlaq, raqaba is mutlaq, unrestricted. Why? It is, the sentence is a command and you have a word without alif lam, a word which is in a command form, khalas, for mutlaq. Everybody's with me so far? That's the first and the most common form. And the second one, the ulama add, is an action, a verb in a state or in a context of command or in a state of affirmation. A verb. That's the second one. Some ulama mention it, some don't, but it's correct to mention it. A verb, a fi'l, in a command form or an affirmation form. A verb. That's it. These are the only two forms. So it's a lot easier than the am, right? Hence why there's less difference of opinion. So let's give an example of this. And how come a fi'l can be in the place of this? The ulama say fi'l fi siyaq al-ithbat takes the same ruling as nakira fi siyaq al-ithbat. Why? Because in Arabic, a fi'l, a verb, can be substituted with a noun, right? Is that possible in Arabic? To substitute a verb with a noun? Yes. You can use a masdar, the verbal noun, to take place of the noun. Those who study Arabic, they know this. A fi'l is a verb, right? And a verbal noun is the way, the action. So to swim is a verb, and swimming is the masdar, right? The act of swimming. A masdar we call it. The masdar can take the place of fi'l. So if we agree upon this in Arabic, therefore the ulama say if we have a fi'l, a verb, it's as if we're using a noun because you can replace them. So therefore, if the indefinite word can teach us or lead to unrestricted, therefore a verb in command or form can also do the same. But look at that. You're taking Arabic, right, nahu, and bringing it into Usul al-Fiqh and trying to make sense of it. That shows you why this subject is so interesting, but also why it can become misread or polluted by the Ahl Bid'ah, because they mess around over there in Arabic and they're bringing that stuff over here too. So what we're taking from this, if you have a verb and it is in a form of affirmation, it is going to lead to unrestricted. Let's give an example. It comes in, for example, Ibn Najjar al-Hanbali, rahimahullah, he mentions in his book, Sharh Kawkab. It's a well-known advanced Hanbali fiqh book, but he just gives an example. Just use the example. He says it's been reported أنه صلى الله عليه وسلم صلى داخل الكعبة. أبي حبيب بلال Ibn Umar. Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam one day he went inside the Kaaba and he prayed 2 rak'ahs. So Ibn Umar came and asked Bilal, what did they pray? What did they pray? He wants to find, because Ibn Umar Sahib al-Sunnah, he was trying to find out. صلى, right? أنه صلى الله عليه وسلم صلى داخل الكعبة. صلى here is a fi'l, and it says that he did it. So it must be in what context? Affirmation, right? He's saying the Prophet prayed in the Kaaba, inside the Kaaba. So what kind of siyaq? Siyaq means context. Is this a denying or affirming? Affirming. It's telling us what the Prophet did, right? That's what affirmation means. He did something. Okay, so what did he pray? Fard, nafal? It's mutlaq. That's the point. Right? Someone comes and say he prayed fard, not nafal. What are you going to tell him? It's mutlaq. You see, someone comes and say you can only, imagine someone told you only fard can be prayed inside the Kaaba. What are you going to tell him? Well, that's mutlaq. How do you get them taqeed? And he'd be like, making up something, right? So the ulama say from here we get Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he prayed fard or nafal. And how do we know this? Because Ibn Umar came after asked Bilal, where did he pray and what he did? And so by itself, just looking at this, without any outside evidence, you can pray anything. If you wanted to practice the sunnah, what are you going to do? I mean, first of all, they're probably not going to open the door for you, right? But Allah gives you the chance one day to get inside. And this is your chance. What are you going to pray? Fard or nafal? Right? Some of us, it's like, if I get inside, well, I'll find out. When you get in there, you're going to do whatever you can do. It's mutlaq, do whatever. You're probably not going to do fard because, what are you going to do? How are you going to do that? Unless, right? So you're going to do whatever you did. It's okay, whatever you prayed there. You got the sunnah, inshallah. That's the point. That's the benefit we learn from this. Because if we didn't know this, we're going to get confused as to when does it count and doesn't. So that's a benefit showing you, because it said the Prophet prayed, and didn't tell us what he prayed, it can be open. You can pray anything. Therefore, because unrestricted. You can't restrict it without proof. Because Ibn Najjar says, it is not possible to carry. This hadith carries the meaning it could be fard or nafil. بمعنى, the meaning is لا يتصور أنها فرض ونفل معا. It can be prayed both nafil and fard at the same time. Therefore, since it's open to it, we're not sure. But this shows the idea that you can take these wordings that way. So therefore, we summarize the wordings for mutlaq, for unrestricted, is what? Two things. Number one, an indefinite word in a context of affirmation, or a verb in the context of affirmation. Khalas. So we're going to look for those to figure out if something is mutlaq. When we find a text which is unrestricted, the second step now, is it restricted or not? How are we going to know? We must look for outside evidences. Any evidence outside of that particular text. في القرآن والسنة. Or other places, right? But we're going to look for the unrestricted. Therefore, that led to the next conversation. The ulama then tried to figure out, when do you carry a restricted text, unrestricted text to become restricted? When do you know? And they summarized this into 4 possible outcomes. And the gist behind this is that if a text is unrestricted, you can only restrict it if the other text which you found with similar wording and shares in 2 things. There's 2 considerations. Pay attention to this. Number 1, the hukum, the ruling. So there must be an agreement on the ruling between these 2 texts. And we're going to see what that means. The hukum, ruling. And number 2, the sabab, the cause for this other ruling. They have to share in cause. Sabab means a cause, the reason. So 2 things you have to check to make sure if you can carry a restricted text and make it, unrestricted text restricted. The ruling and the reason. That's 2 R's. Ruling and reason. Right? Hukum wa sabab. And what is meant by this is that, let's say we have a text which is like the one we're reading, فَتَحْرِيرُ رَقَبَةٍ. Allah says to free a slave. If I have another text that talks about a slave, and it says the slave is a believing slave, how do I know these 2 texts go together or not? That's what the ulama tried to figure out. So we need to have commonalities, otherwise we're going to be restricting random things and get wrong, right? We're going to end up changing the intent of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's sharia. So therefore, there are 4 outcomes. In reality, 2 of them count and 2 don't. So we'll just mention the 2 that count. Because unless you want to memorize all of them, so if you memorize the ones that count, the other ones don't count. Easier, right? Because if you know what is, you don't need to know the others. So when do you carry an unrestricted text to become restricted? 2 scenarios. Scenario 1. They both texts agree in ruling and reason. Hukum wa sabab. Both texts carry the similar ruling and reason. Okay, that's the first one. That's perfect. That's like the best case. They agree in ruling and reason. Hukum wa sabab. Scenario 2. So what's the first scenario? They both texts I'm looking at, they have the same kind of entity, but one has a qualifier, other doesn't. We carry them to each other, and we restrict the unrestricted with the restricted, if they share in the ruling, the hukum, and the sabab, the reason. Second scenario, they share the ruling, but not the reason. They share in ruling, not the reason. Share in ruling, not the reason. So there's a agreement in the hukum and not the sabab. What do? You still carry it. So what is the strength here? Hukum. The hukum is the strength. The other 2 scenarios don't count. Right? So if they differ in ruling but same reason, not good. And they differ in ruling and reason, but then of course, right, they don't count. So the key question should be then, as we're going to examine, do they share in the same ruling, in type and in kind? And some ulama say that's what you should just focus on. Just look for the hukum. The hukum is the same between them. Forget about the sabab. So we're going to look now some examples to understand how does that work. The benefit behind this is that the ulama then, they would differ at times, right? Whether a restricted text, unrestricted text is restricted. And why would they differ? Who can understand why would they differ? What do you think where are they going to be differing? Yeah. Good. They're going to differ the same rulings on these texts, on the same causes, but mostly the rulings. That's what they're going to differ. Or they may differ whether or not the text can be harmonized, as we saw before, example, rather than trying to restrict. All right, so we're going to see that that's where they differed. And this teaches us then that sometimes the text, which again, the rule, any text which is unrestricted is kept unrestricted until otherwise proven. So you cannot just make up restrictions, you have to have proof. But the reason why the ulama differ then is that it has impact, and not as much as the last week's lesson, because they differ whether or not they share in ruling or in reason. Okay, so we're going to give some examples now, inshallah ta'ala. And before going there, there's one more thing that we didn't talk about, which is to do with the difference between restriction and nasakh, abrogation. For there is also a discussion here, right? The difference between these two. So the same way there's a difference between specification and abrogation. Abrogation is different. So the ulama, they say that when you get a text and one is restricted and one is unrestricted, we carry them upon each other as long as the ruling is shared, as long as this will not lead to abrogation. But what is abrogation? What does abrogation mean? Good. One ruling comes after another ruling, and it's not possible for the first ruling, or second ruling, to have not been present in the earlier time. Means if it was necessary, it would have been mentioned. Because the rule is, let's say Nabi said something, then he had to restrict it. He will restrict it when? At that moment. But let's say there's something the Prophet said, and 2 years later he said something else. What's happening here now? That's abrogation, because it happened later, because we have time, we're going to get to it. You have a date, time stamped here, timing. But also the fact that it's not possible the Prophet should have said this. If he needed to say, he would have said it then, not now. Because لا يجوز تأخير بيان عن وقت حاجة. You can't delay explanations from the time of need. It's like me telling you, for example, brother, here's the ruling, and I come 10 days later and say, okay, remember, actually this is the specific 10 days later, it's too late. Because you need to say it then. So therefore, scholars say if it's not abrogation, and we're going to look at a key example of that later to show you sometimes the ulama differ. Something is nasakh or is it mutlaq muqayyad. You see, that's another conversation. Some are saying abrogation, some say no, mutlaq muqayyad. I'm going to give you an example. Okay, let's look at example. We mentioned before some examples of this, but we'll just get into real fiqh examples to better appreciate this. I don't know which one should I start with here. Let's see. We did one before a long time ago. Inshallah ta'ala, we'll get that one out. Let's look at a simple example first. Okay. Should a person do wudu after washing a dead body? This is the masala. Should a person do wudu right after no, that's not the issue. That's another issue. We'll skip this one. That's not the issue. Oh, this is a good example. The zakat. This is a good example. Zakat. We use this one. The zakat. Which zakat or animals, livestock, is zakat owing on? Is it on all livestock, which are in the three categories? So cow, sheep, or goat. Is it all of them? Or is it only the ones who are freely grazing? Means the ones in which you are not feeding them, like how you would do like a domesticated animal. Rather these are going and grazing. Right, so this is a discussion. So it should be animal which grazes on the land in a pasture, or is it the one which all of them who fall into it and I'm feeding? And so here the ulama, they differed into groups. Right? So group 1 said no zakat on any of the three types of animals, cow, sheep, or goat, which is غير السائمة. Sa'ima means it's not freely grazing the pasture. The second group, they said, zakat is owing on any of these three categories, whether they're freely grazing or being fed by their owner. And some went down the middle. What's the difference of opinion? حمل المطلق على المقيد. The conversation of restricted and unrestricted. So this is where the conversation is. And how do we know this? Well, we go back to the evidences. So everyone's following so far the description. Because we all know you have to give zakat on the animal, on the livestock. No one is differing on that, right? What differing is which one. Which one? So we studied this in the fiqh class already. So we're gonna get the evidence. Number one, group one, who says it's only the one who's grazing. They bring the hadith. Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam says, "Fi kulli ibn sa'imah," for every grazing camel. That's one text. Fi kulli sa'imah ibn, right? It's another one. Another version of hadith. Fi kulli sa'imatin, unrestricted there. For every what's it called, livestock which is grazing. So the Prophet keep mentioning this word. Or another version, they use this version very clearly in the Sunan. Fi sa'imati or sa'imati al-ghanam az-zakat. So the Prophet said ghanam, and he was sa'ima, showing what? The one that's grazing. So what did he do? If it's just ghanam, unrestricted, the Prophet qualified with which restriction? What did he use to restrict it? The word sa'ima, which is like a descriptor. So now we can see what it means to make taqeed. Taqeed is when you introduce words, right? Like nouns or adjectives to describe something. That's clear text, right? So therefore they say that as long as it's grazing in the pasture alone, then therefore it counts. As for the one that is not, the Prophet ﷺ said, didn't mention that description. Okay, so the other group, right, who said mutlaq muqayyid, said that it's both categories. So they're going to argue the sa'ima is from the behemoth al-an'am. So they're going to say that this is just like the others. It's just a type from the types. But the problem we're saying is that Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam, when he used this description continuously, is he restricting or is not restricting? He's restricting. So therefore the correct opinion is the view of those who say it's those who are, the ulama, which most scholars, is that those animals which are only grazing freely in the pasture. As for animals which are being fed by the human or by the owner, then this one is not part of this because he's not in this category. Does that make sense? That's an example where you have a literal wording, right? Another one has a general wording, so they can't use the general there. Let's get an easier example for our times, which has to do with the issue of keeping the pants below the ankle. We studied this issue before. We're going to revisit it based on Usul al-Fiqh. Because we said before this issue, some of the ulama, many of them, when they analyzed it, they analyzed the evidences that say that the one who keeps his pants below ankle will be punished, right? They said that this is considered restricted by the evidences that say that it is done with arrogance, right? You guys probably heard this because, again, this is what's being told. So how do we understand this before? How do we explain it? We said, well, the problem that's happening is that the ulama who take that view, they did not look carefully at the two issues that we're handling here, the sabab and the hukum. That's what we're referring over, the sabab and hukum. And if you remember, we said that if isbal is prohibited, this is a rule, it's prohibited. Let's analyze the both evidences and take a look at whether or not it meets the condition of holding them together, putting them together. Let us take a look at some of the wordings. قال عليه الصلاة والسلام ما أسفل من الكعبين من الإزار ففي النار. Whatever is below the two ankles of the izar is in the hellfire. Okay, so Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam just mentioned here, right, unrestrictedly or generally here. And then we have another hadith that says that whoever does this out of khuyala, right, which is the word for arrogance. Right? So for example, they bring the wording من جر إزاره بطرا, whoever drags izar bataran. So there we go, jarra izaruhu bataran. So whoever jarra fi'l izaruhu, this is whoever is dragging his lower garment bataran. That's the qaid. Right? They're saying, look, is it restricted? Bataran, arrogance. And they bring other wordings like this. So is this correct then? حمل مطلق على مقيد. So whoever does it out of arrogance, that one في النار. Whoever does with arrogance, then it's makruh. Because the text says that the other text show that this is considered, right, something wrong. So they say that there's two, but we're going to say this is not correct. And why is it not correct? Because some of the ulama say, well, first of all, mutlaq and muqayyid, there are conditions. So the hukum on these two, the sabab for the first one and the sabab for the second one is not the consideration, it's the hukum, the punishment we're looking at. What is the punishment for somebody who drags izar mutlaqan, unrestrictedly? So the ahadith that come and say izar muslim in nisf al-saq, that's where you're supposed to keep it the highest. ولا حرج ولا جناح فيما بينه وبين الكعبين. You can keep it up until your ankles, that's the max. Then the Prophet ﷺ said, ما كان أسفل من الكعبين فهو في النار. That's the first part. Whatever is below the ankles is in the fire. So that's one punishment. Then the second, من جر إزار بطرا, whoever does it out of arrogance, though, لم ينظر الله إليه, Allah won't look at him. We have two different punishments. So can we say the hukum or the sabab is the same here? One, he just did it, ففي النار. And one who did it بطرا, لم ينظر الله إليه, Allah won't look at him. So you have two different reasons, arrogance to arrogance. And what is the difference? Hellfire, Allah won't look at you. Aha, you see? So it's not hamil mutlaq qayyid is not going to work here. Because we have different sabab hukum, two different punishments and two different reasons. So why is that? Because what they do, the other ulama, they look at the different texts separately. We have one hadith, he says all of them one time, Abu Dawud, he mentions all of them. He keeps going. So what does this teach us? You can't carry them together because what's the difference? What's the sabab for the first one, the person going to hellfire? Is below his ankle. What's the cause for the other one? Allah not seeing him? Arrogance. اختلاف السبب. And the hukum also, اختلاف العذاب. So not going to work here. Also, not to mention, some ulama they talk about, and they go deeper than that, but we can just even take away the whole argument by going and getting a hadith. إياك وإسبال الإزار. Hadith of Jabir bin Sulaym. Nabi Sallallahu said, beware of إسبال of the izar. فإنها من المخيلة. All of it is from arrogance. That's it. قضي الأمر. That's the game over right there. Right? فإنها, all of it, من المخيلة. All of it is arrogance. وإن الله لا يحب المخيلة. Allah doesn't love arrogance. So that hadith, you can't do nothing with that one. Right? Some of the wording says, right, all of it is arrogance. And that's the wording the ulama uses to proof. So the reason I'm saying this is because you're going to hear someone going to say, حمل مطلق المقيد. We're going to say, no, it's not going to work here. اختلاف السبب والحكم. شروط, right? Or some ulama even go further and say, is this the hadith can be even explained other ways. So that's why Imam Sana'ani, we cited excellent risala he has on this, where he explains beautifully. So that's a good example for also showing that you can't always just carry them together. Let us give another example to show us, right? Because again, the difference between what's ulama here are not as many as the other one. Let's give the example of the sandals and Hajj Umrah. Because there is discussion then about whether or not, when you're going for Hajj or Umrah, is it a must that your sandals, we studied this before, or you're wearing, should they be below the ankle or above the ankle, or is it abrogated or not? So that is a discussion the ulama they mention. Because at the end of the day, when we look at the discussion, we can see that the ulama differed about what is the intent behind the hadith. So if we go back to the lessons we mentioned, the difference of opinion really is the summary of it is that Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam in one hadith prior to his Hajj, he talked about having the sandals, and whoever doesn't have shoes can wear the khuf, and he must cut it under the ankles. And then Hajj al-Wada', he didn't mention this ruling, his final farewell Hajj when he was there. he talked about people wearing the sandals and the shoes were for Hajj, and he didn't mention cutting it below the ankle. So some of the wording just say, whoever doesn't find نعلين فليبس خفين, just wear خفين. Doesn't say cut below the ankle. So what's the issue here? Hajj al-Wada' happens at the end of Rasul's life, and the hadith about the other one come before. So some Sahaba asked somebody, said below the ankle. When he went for Hajj, everybody went, he didn't mention that. Group A of the ulama, حمل مطلق al-muqayyid. So what did they say? Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam's words, when he said to wear, if you can't find shoes, وَلَمْ يَجِدْ نَعْلَيْنِ فَلْيَلْبَسِ الْخُفَيْنِ. If you don't have 2 sandals, wear 2 leather socks. He kept it unrestricted, right? He just said, just wear them. نعلين, you don't have them, wear خفين. He didn't tell us what type. So they're going to say, well, the year before that, or the years before that, when someone asked him, he said below the ankle. So, mutlaq, muqayyid, boom. Same topic, right? Same ruling. And the other group, the ulama say no. Why? Because Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, in that period, when he was asked that question, Hajj al-Wada', the final farewell Hajj, when everybody's there, the whole ummah, is he allowed for him to not explain this for those who didn't come for him Hajj before or not? If he clarified something before, but now he didn't clarify. So this delay in clarification shows what? Abrogation. وهو منسوخ. Therefore it goes back to itlaq. You guys following me? Because Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam Hajj al-Wada', it's time for everyone to ask the questions about Hajj. خُذُوا عَنِّي مَنَاسِكَكُمْ. He didn't tell us? What does that mean? Mutlaq and mansukh, the other one. Allahu A'lam. This seems to me, Allahu A'lam, a stronger view. And this is why, because at the end of the day, Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam didn't tell us. So you can see both opinions are strong, right? But the scholars who say it has to be below ankle, you know where they're coming from now, right? You follow the argument? They say that hadith that doesn't mention it, the other one mentions it, Hamal Mutlaq al-Muqayyid, go. The other group said, nope. If we were to do Hamal Mutlaq al-Muqayyid, hold restricted or unrestricted, we get what? We fall into a problem. لا يجوز تخيير بيان عن وقت الحاجة. It's not allowed for Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam to delay explanation time of need. Is Hajj Wada', people are going for the Hajj first time, some of them only time. And they have sandals, or some have khuf, like leather socks, and they're not cut it. And he didn't tell them? What does that mean then? Is it fathomable, guys? Is it possible? Maybe someone saw someone do something wrong and he didn't tell them? Never. So what does it mean then? He didn't tell them because it's abrogated. Wallahu a'lam, that seems to be more inclined. But both arguments are qawi. It's strong, right? So that's why you go for Hajj, you see some people there have very long sandals, have very short ones, right? Most of us, we don't have long sandals. So you're already on this view, huh? Like someone's thinking, I don't even know what's going on, right? You have to know. When you go for Hajj Umrah, you're supposed to know your sandal wears green light or red light. And that's the problem with Hajj Umrah. People go there and they find everything. Right? Especially on the way. Like, oh, I'm about to miqat, got the wrong gear. It's like, what's going on here? Sometimes you wonder, like, after all this payment, you gotta get it right. But the reason I'm saying is at least now you know the difference. Let's give another example, one more. The issue of Masah al-Khufayn. Oh, God, heated debates about this. What is the Masah al-Khufayn? And so what's the discussion about? The ahadith of Masah, wiping over the leather socks or other types like foot gear. Are they mutlaq or muqayyid? Huh? Mutlaq. Every single text. It's a qa'idah. Right? They were going to see every text that comes about it is mutlaq. Right? There's no way you can bring a proof that says socks are. It says khuffayn, or someone says jawrabayn, or just mentions na'alayn. It doesn't tell us anything about the type. So, one of the biggest problems that comes in this discussion, and I already mentioned the principle, all the texts about wiping the socks are unrestricted. Therefore, the one who restricts it in terms of conditions of height, or type, or thickness, فَعَلَيْهِ دَلِيل. Upon him is the dalil. See, someone going to come and say leather. Where's the dalil? Hadith mutlaq. When hadith says leather socks, khuf, that's what it means. But that doesn't mean that's the only one they're wiping on, right? It's like saying Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam wiping khuf, yes, and jawrabayn, wa na'alayn. So why you only bring that one? Or someone says it has to be 3 past the ankle. What's the dalil for that? Is the dalil for it? Someone say because that's the place mahal fard. You have to. That's where you gotta wash. There's no washing. It's wiping. You see, what's the problem there, brothers? We're gonna explain this. They say it has to be above the ankles. Why? في الغسل, when you're washing your legs in wudu, where is you wash until? The ankles. Is this مسح or غسل? مسح for اختلاف الحكم. اختلاف الحكم. You can't make مثل مقيد here. قياس not gonna work. حكم متى مسح شيخنا غسل غسل. So you see that قياس not gonna work. And also Nabi some Sahaba they did that or not. I have holes in my socks. Can I wipe? I did it on mutlaq. Yes, what else is a sock except it has a hole sometimes, right? Or someone says see-through. It's mutlaq. Who says it can be see-through? Any text that comes in wiping, all mutlaq, khalas. You see, because what's the hikmah, ulama say? What is masah for? What's the wiping for? Taysir. So the qaida, you can't take something the sharia made be easy, make it hard. The whole point is to make it easy. Now you made it hard. Allahu Akbar. That's a strong argument. The whole point of wiping was to make life easier, but suddenly we took something easy and made it harder. Because now you say you gotta be this tall and you gotta carry this much water and you gotta walk this much miles. What's going on here? Who does that kind of testing when they go to the store? Right? When you go to the store, you're looking at the shape, size, you're putting water in there. Gonna get in trouble, right? So the problem is there's no proof for that. You see, now you understand the whole mas'ala. Khalas. With this qawaid, the whole mas'ala khuffayn shows khalas. You don't need to, even if you remember any adilla, all you know is mutlaq. Khalas, okay. Anybody who says otherwise, you're gonna tell them alayhi dalil. And you're not gonna see any dalil. In fact, you find the opposite. That's why some ulama went so far so you can wipe on shoes. بدون جوربين, without socks. And they went that far. Imagine that. There's discussion like this. It's interesting. But why I'm saying is because we learned that. It's mutlaq. Shaykh Uthaymeen pushed this argument and others very well. And they mentioned again this review of Shaykh Ibn Taymiyyah and others. So that's a great example, right? So to show you then, at the end of the day, mutlaq and muqayyad are very useful to conversation. All you then have to know is when you find a wording which is unrestricted, another one that shares in the ruling at the very least, even if it differs in the cause, what are you going to do? We're going to see that if the ruling is shared, we can restrict this unrestricted. Otherwise, we keep it unrestricted. And that's the beauty of the deen. And also, we're going to see, and maybe next week we'll look at some more examples, that the benefit behind this conversation, and all these are looking at, is the practicality of fiqh, to go back to fiqh in the things that we already know and understand it in the ways that we didn't understand it before. حتى في العقيدة, right? Maybe we'll give some examples later. مطلق مقيد and عام الخاص في العقيدة. And that's very important because the ulama say the عقيدة and fiqh, they go together. Usul fiqh and عقيدة and all these topics, they're hand to hand. So therefore, the person who strengthens his knowledge in Usul fiqh, he actually can be able to strengthen the Aqidah al-Sunnah al-Jama'ah by bringing the evidences and their intended meanings. And it's also important for us to practice with examples. The more examples you look at, as we'll see later, the easier it is for us to remember these principles. And the good news also, these are masail which are classic, the classical examples. So it's not like we're going to reinvent the wheel. We can already analyze and see what the ulama already said, and we're just analyzing to see and the different views. And then later on, when new issues come up, this is when the ulama obviously are applying it, and we're just looking at also those different views. طيب, we'll end with this much, inshallah ta'ala. If anyone has any quick questions. Yes. Yeah, so now the ayah about freeing the slave for killing and the freeing slave for dihar or other things, they're both slaves. One makes you believe, one makes you not believing. So the sabab is slightly different, but the hukm is wajib, right? Both of them wajib. Both you have to free slaves. So they say hukm is connected. So that's why they say therefore you connect them. But had the hukm been different, that's the problem. So an example of when the hukm doesn't work, let's take a look at biki tayammum. So in tayammum, when you go to ayat al-wudu, Allah tells us what to wash, right? A wipe. So let's say فَامْسَحُوا بِوُجُوهِكُمْ وَأَيْدِيكُمْ مِنْ. That's a good example. So the Shafi'iyya, where do they say you have to wipe? Until here, right? The elbow. The Shafi'iyya on that view. And in the other view, the majority of ulama say no, up until the wrist. Right? So most of us, we know the hadith Rasulullah showed us. But why did the Shafi'iyya go to that direction? They said, well, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, to wash your hands, وجوهكم أيديكم إلى المرافق. Wash your hands until your elbows. And later on he says, وأيديكم من. أيديكم. So they carry the مطلق مقيد. أيديكم من. Min when? Right? Where? Okay. إلى المرافق. What's wrong with it? The first one is to do wudu. And what is the hukum there? Ghasl. And this is masah. Not going to work. Even though both of them are about washing. So you could say the sabab behind it, or the reason rationale, I'm getting ready for salah, but the two different ways I'm doing it. So that's why it didn't work. And then the clarifier is the hadith Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Right, so for example, Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam, when he showed Ammar bin Yasir and others how to do it, did he do this? No, they bring a hadith which is weak that says that you can. So we can see now the benefit that hadith Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But in case someone comes and says, no, the ayah said, what are we going to tell them? You can't carry the unrestricted, restricted here. Simple, right? So there are plenty of examples. Next week we'll mention many examples. The more examples, look at, the easier to remember this. But the benefit behind it is that let's say you get into an issue, a fiqh, and you want to check the reason. The most important thing for talib al-ilm then is not to study the hukum. That's not for talib al-ilm. Talib al-ilm wants to know the hukum. What? Dalala. I want to know why. Because I'm supposed to carry the views to others. I can't just know the ruling. An army person who would want to know the ruling, right? What's the ruling on this? No problem. Me, I'm trying to find out, okay, why and how we got there. Why? Because someone may ask you, well, how do you know? You're going to be like, well, that's the Sheikh so-and-so said. Then I say, well, my Sheikh says otherwise. So now we're safe footing, right? Doesn't look very good. Sheikh so-and-so, you're supposed to talk about him, he's not. You're going to say, well, Sheikh so-and-so, with all his respect, this is the why we don't agree with him in this issue. And the benefit we also take is we also practice the benefit behind studying the deen. Because the Sharia, the beauty behind it is, it's based on dalil wa ta'leel, evidence and rationality. That's what's missing in today's era. A lot of ignorant people out there talking about the deen, they think they have the ilm, they don't have dalil wa ta'leel. The aql is broken and the evidence is lost. And they're walking around talking. So what are you going to do? You're going to come on both sides. Manqul wal ma'qul, you're going to hit them with both punches. With logic, with the adillah, you're going to be lost. Because these guys got us. Because today, that's what's happening. Some people walk around and say, well, we know the truth. And they're talking to people. And what's sad though, is that even the awam can't tell this guy is wrong. So that's why sometimes the ulama, when they look at it, they can't even believe it, that this is actually passing, right? But the problem we also know is that if we know the truth by itself is powerful. But what we need to do is be better to explain it in times of need. For example, maybe we'll look at later, some of them contemporary issues can also go back to some of these principles. Right? We'll see. Right? Any last questions? I think it's not anything online. I don't think so. Okay, barakallahu feekum. Subhanakallahumma bihamdik. Ashhadu an la ilaha illa ant. Astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk.